Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the call to discuss the draft final proposal on the revision of the decisional classification rules. This is for the EIM Governance Review Initiative. My name is Christina Osborne. I work in Stakeholder Affairs here at the ISO. Also joining me in the room from legal, we have Jennifer Watts and Bert Gross. Bert is actually going to be the primary presenter. And from our Regional Affairs Office, we have Stacey Crowley, Vicki Imam, and Peter Calusi. So just to let you know, the materials for this initiative are actually located out on the Western EIM page. There's an Initiatives tab, so you'll find the materials linked closer to the bottom of the page. You can also access the materials by going to the ISO public calendar. We are recording this call. We'll make that recording available out on the Western EIM website, so look for that by the end of this week, I would say, early. So briefly go over the agenda. So Bert Gross, as I mentioned, he's the primary presenter. He's going to do the introduction and overview, and then he's going to go into the specifics of the draft final proposal, and then also go over the next steps for this initiative. So there are I think there's 5 slides that we're going to walk through today, but we are going to pause for questions. So if you do have a question, you can enter the queue by pressing #2, and we just ask that you identify yourself first. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bert.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Bert Gross. I'm from the legal department. And as Christina mentioned, we're here today to talk about the ISO's draft final proposal on the decisional classification rules. And that's part of the overall EIM governance review process that the EIM governing body kicked off late last year. And as Christina mentioned, what I'll do is provide a little bit of background and briefly go over the draft final proposal itself, and followed by a few words on next steps, and then that all probably will take less than 15 minutes, I think. We'll see, and then we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions. So first, the background. The Charter on Energy Imbalance Market Governance directed or states that the EIM governing body should initiate by no later than September of 2020 a review of the EIM governance in light of the accumulated experience up until the date of the review. And at the EIM governing body's request, we, the CAISO staff, initiated that review with a paper that was put out on December 14th, the December 14th issue paper and straw proposal on EIM governance review. And as the name of that paper suggests, the December 14th paper was split up into 2 different parts. Most of you are familiar with this probably, but just to go over the background. There was a straw proposal that sought comment on a relatively narrow incremental change to our current decisional classification rules. And then there was also an issue paper that had a broader discussion of potential topics that could be over time included in the EIM governance review. As we had hoped, we got quite robust stakeholder comment on both parts of that paper, the December 14th paper, with I'm not sure 22 or 23 sets of comments from really a wide variety of stakeholders, which is great from our perspective. Comments generally reflected strong support for the straw proposal component of the paper, and as expected, we also received what I would call a much broader and more diverse set of comments on the various issues that we had teed up as potential topics for overall EIM governance review. In light of that feedback, we put out the paper that we're talking about today, the February 11th draft final proposal, specifically on the decisional classification issue. That proposal, and this is probably the most important thing to take away from this call, is unchanged from the December 14th straw proposal. So we're going to cover, when I get to that, it's going to sound somewhat familiar what I'm saying about what that proposal entails. The February 11th paper doesn't attempt to address the broader set of topics that were part of the issue paper, part of the December 14th paper. It's my understanding that the EIM governing body is going to have a discussion in its public session on March 12th in Albuquerque about how to move forward on those issues, next steps, things of that nature. And I guess that's a plug for folks to tune in or come to that session in Albuquerque to provide input and have a discussion on that topic. But the topic today is the straw proposal. I think you can go to the next page, because now I'm going to turn to the actual draft final proposal. Of course, a little bit of background is necessary to understand where the draft final proposal comes from. The ISO's tariff has a provision in it that requires that any changes to market rules that are embodied in the ISO's tariff have to be approved by the EIM governing, the proposal has to be approved by the EIM governing body, has to be approved by the Board of Governors before it can be filed with FERC. So when the EIM governing body was developed and established, what happened is the board delegated a component or certain aspects of that decisional approval authority to the EIM governing body. And as probably almost everyone on this call knows, that delegation was divided into two different categories. A primary authority category, in other words, rules for which the EIM governing body has primary approval authority, and then also in a set of rules for which the EIM governing body has advisory review authority. For matters that are within the EIM governing body's primary authority, the ISO management proposal to revise a market rule first goes to the EIM governing body for approval, and then if it's approved by the EIM governing body, it ends up on the Board of Governors consent calendar for a more perfunctory form of review rather than a full review of the management proposal. For matters that are within the EIM governing body's advisory authority, the ISO management proposal goes first to the EIM governing body for advisory input, and the EIM governing body can choose whether to provide no input or provide written input or oral input, and then that input, if there is any, is then discussed when the board takes up the issue on its regular agenda for a full discussion for matters that are within the advisory authority. And just in terms of the terms we use, the terminology we use, we call the rules that we use to identify which matters are within the EIM governing body's primary authority versus those that are in its advisory authority, the decisional classification rules. Now, under our current decisional classification rules, the scope of the EIM governing body's primary authority is determined entirely based upon the type of market rule that is at issue, the type as opposed to the motivation behind it. So specifically, the EIM governing body currently has primary authority over proposed changes to market rules that are EIM specific. And EIM specific means that they are either rules that apply uniquely to the EIM balancing authority areas, or they are rules that apply differently to the EIM balancing authorities than to other areas within the real-time market. So it's EIM specific rules, and the rules that are either unique to the EIM or that apply differently to EIM. By contrast, the advisory authority under the current rules applies to all generally applicable real-time market rules, as well as any generally applicable rules that apply to the participation in ISO markets generally. So, for example, credit rules, things of that nature. Turning now to the proposed change that was proposed in the straw proposal and now in the draft final proposal. We're proposing to make a relatively incremental change, I would say, to a subset of the generally applicable real-time market rules so that they will now no longer be advisory but rather primary for the EIM governing body. And that subset is specifically when there is an issue specific to an EIM balancing authority area that is the primary driver for a proposed change, again, to a generally applicable real-time market rule. In that context, the proposal would be that would now fall under the EIM governing body's primary approval authority rather than advisory. So again, the point is, if there's a generally applicable real-time market rule, if the primary driver is EIM, that would now be primary for the EIM governing body rather than advisory. As we described in the paper, the reason that this change is being proposed is because it would have the effect of ensuring that the body that has really the greatest interest in the change would be the one who would play the lead role in deciding whether to approve the change. As I've described, in any context, both the governing body and the board have a role, but that it would really be a change in who takes the lead. I should mention, and the paper mentions this as well, that we already have a version of a primary driver test that we use in the context of hybrid policy initiatives. And to review, hybrid policy initiatives are ones where there are various piece parts, various specific rule changes that are being proposed, but they cannot be thought of and implemented separately. They're really a package, one inextricably intertwined set of proposals. And in that situation, we call those hybrid policy initiatives. And in that context, because you could have a situation where some of them are EIM primary and some of the rules are not, we developed this primary driver test to say if the overall policy initiative, the primary driver for the overall policy initiative is EIM, then those procedurally go through the two-board approval process differently than if that's not the case. So we already have that concept in a hybrid context, and what we're really proposing now is to also have a primary driver test in the context of non-hybrid proposals, where we'll be looking at individualized rule changes and determining whether or not, if they are generally applicable real-time rules, whether the primary driver of that is EIM or not. So that's the basic change. I should mention also that we are not actually changing the way the hybrid rules work, and I want to make that point because there was one stakeholder comment from previous that talked a little bit about our hybrid rules. We're not proposing to make any changes to the way the hybrid rules work, and the paper makes this point. We're just proposing to change the way that individualized rule changes are addressed, and there will then be a similar test, which is the point we were trying to make in our paper. So that's basically the proposal. We did also prepare revisions to the two documents, the two governance-related documents that would need to be changed to implement that proposal. Those two documents are the Charter for Energy Imbalance Market Governance and a guidance document that describes how the process for handling policy initiatives that are within the EIM governing body primary or advisory authority roles. Those two documents were attached both to the straw proposal and to the draft final proposal, and we didn't make any changes. So it's the same red lines in both papers. And obviously, if folks have comments on how we're proposing to implement this in the language documents, we'd be happy to receive those comments in addition to any further comments on the proposal as a whole. I think we can turn now to the next steps slide. And just to touch briefly on next steps, as we noted in the February 11th paper, we're asking stakeholders to submit any comments that they might have by no later than March 1st. I should mention that because the proposal is identical to the prior proposal, I'm not sure how many folks will want to make comments. If you don't make comments, I think we'll probably assume that means your comments from the prior round are still valid. But certainly if folks want to make comments, if they have anything different to say or new, or maybe didn't comment previously on this topic but want to, all those are welcome, as well as anything else that anybody has to say on the topic. I think our current plan is to bring that draft final proposal to the March 12th meeting of the EM governing body in Albuquerque, followed by, assuming it's approved by the EM governing body, then to the March 27th and 28th meeting of the Board of Governors. That's pretty much what I have for today. So it probably makes sense to let people have some opportunity for questions and answers.
Well, yeah, that's it for the presentation. So we'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A. So again, if you have a question, you can enter the queue by pressing #2. So Noreen, if you can just let me know if anybody's entered the queue. Appreciate it.
And we have a question. Caller, please go ahead. The line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Laura Trelise with Public Generating Pool. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Laura.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation and for holding the call today. I'll just start by saying PGP is supportive of this proposal, and I appreciated the explanation. The way that the motivation test would be done is similar or the same to how the primary driver is determined for the hybrid initiative. One question I had is, it sounds like CAISO staff are the ones determining the primary driver, and I think you might have this in a document already, so apologies for not doing all my homework on this, but if there's a disagreement on the primary driver, let's say that stakeholders disagree with how CAISO staff has classified the primary driver to be, how does that get resolved and who makes the final decision on what the primary driver is?
Thank you for that. Actually, it's a really good question and maybe something I should have gone over in the presentation. But the way the process works, it's been set up so that throughout the stakeholder process for any policy initiatives, as early as possible, staff puts out a proposed classification based on the status of the proposals as they exist at that time in our public stakeholder process, and that becomes part of each of the substantive stakeholder papers. And in addition to providing comments, in addition to the opportunity for stakeholders to provide comments on the substantive proposal, we encourage them to provide comments on what you would call at that point the sort of provisional classification of the stakeholder initiative or the individual parts of it. So what happens is as the stakeholder process goes forward, there's an iterative process where it is sort of the staff, view about it, and we take comments on that staff view, and sometimes as a result of those comments, and also sometimes as a result of the way a stakeholder process changes, over time the proposal changes, and then in the draft, at the time of the draft final proposal, so a paper like the one we just put out for this, but if it were about a stakeholder market initiative, there would be a proposed draft final proposal that would be in that paper. Stakeholders again would be able to put comments in on that, and then what happens is that proposal goes to the chair of the EIM governing body and the chair of the Board of Governors are made aware through a posting of what the proposed classification is. If they have any questions about that, there's an opportunity for either or both of them to speak with staff and see and understand it better. But if in the end of the day there were an actual disagreement between the EIM governing body chair and the board chair with regard to the classification, the proposed classification, then the guidance document has in it a process that is used. There would be actually a public process where the EIM governing body and the board would convene to make a determination jointly about the appropriate classification for the proceeding. We haven't had that happen yet, and part of the goal is to make sure that the process of trying to identify the classification and then get stakeholder comments is robust enough so that by the end, we're making a decision that is broadly supported in that area. And I should also mention that I'll ask Jennifer Rotz. I'm looking at her. She's in the room today. She's more familiar with this than me, but I think also the EIM governing body chair and the board chair are at least made aware of whatever comments the stakeholders have made during the stakeholder process if there's a dispute on the proposal.
That's right. Any stakeholder objections to the decisional classification would be noted in the notice that goes out to the chairs, and that notice is also posted on the initiative webpage for the policy initiative, so it's available for stakeholders to read.
Okay, thank you, both Bert and Jennifer. And my second question is regarding the impact of the change. I think it may be a bit unclear how big of an impact this proposal will be, and I was wondering if it would be possible for CAISO staff to take the catalog, the policy initiatives catalog, and show, based on this change, what initiatives would move from advisory to primary, and if that could be even part of the presentation to the EIM governing body, I think that would be really helpful to help stakeholders understand the impact. Would that be possible?
Well, I think I don't know the answer for sure, but I will take that. I'll take that comment. We'll take it under consideration for certain. I would say one thing that's a little bit of a challenge in this is that, as I was mentioning, the proceedings, when you try to make classification determinations early in a stakeholder process, which is kind of the nature of the situation when you're talking about a stakeholder catalog that goes out a year or sometimes longer, you end up already you're kind of making a best judgment about what the proposal is going to be in the end of the day. So there's a little bit of challenge around that, around doing that. But I understand the concern, and we'll obviously think about whether there's a way to do that won't actually somehow cause more confusion than would otherwise be the case. I do think, generally speaking, this is a relatively narrow change. To incremental change, so I wouldn't expect that it would have result in large changes across many policy initiatives. But as far as I know, we haven't done that analysis.
Okay, thanks. That was my take as well, that this is a pretty narrow change and would have very limited impact. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Noreen, do we have anybody else in the queue?
We do not have any other questions at this time.
No? Okay. Well, we look forward to your comments on March 1st. Send those to the initiative comments at KAISO.com mailbox. If you have any follow-up questions after this meeting concludes, you're welcome also to send those to that mailbox, and we'll make sure that we address them. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Noreen.
My pleasure. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now